Handling of inadvertently rejected records on invoice management system IMS. Let us say a supplier has uploaded an invoice in respect of an recipient in his GSTR 1A. This invoice will get populated in the invoice management system of the recipient. The recipient, if he accepts that invoice, it will flow into his GSTR 2B, thereafter into his GSTR 3B, and he will be able to take the input credit on that invoice. But in the current instance, what has happened is the recipient has inadvertently rejected that invoice. Thereby, he will be denied the credit because that invoice input tax credit will not flow into 2B and 3B of the recipient. Now, by wrongly rejecting that invoice, the recipient has already filed his GSTR 3B and did not take the input tax credit. Now, what is the recourse available to the recipient? What the recipient has to do is he has to inform his supplier. Thereby, the supplier will again upload the invoice in his GSTR 1A or in amendment table of GSTR 1 or if statement of the subsequent period. Thereafter, what will happen? Again, this re-uploaded invoice will be populated in the invoice management system of the recipient. Now the recipient has to accept that invoice. It will flow into his GSTR 2B and thereafter into his GSTR 3B, but not in the current period, but in the next month, because the recipient has rejected the original invoice and already furnished the 3B. So in that period, he will not be able to get the credit again, but he will be getting the credit in the subsequent month. And in the subsequent month, he has to accept in his invoice management system. Thereby, that ITC will get populated in his GSTR 3B and he will be able to take the credit. Now, in such a situation, what will be the liability of the supplier? Once the invoice is originally rejected, the liability of the supplier will not get changed, right? Now what will happen? The supplier will be informed by the recipient, or the supplier through his IMS dashboard will come to know that the invoice has been rejected. Now after examining that or confirming that it has been wrongly rejected by the recipient, what the supplier has to do? He has to again upload that invoice in his 1A or amendment table of 1 or if statement in the subsequent period. Now the liability, there will be zero impact on the liability of the supplier, because the amended tables calculates only the delta value or differential tax liability. Since there is no difference in the tax liability, the original invoice which got rejected is as it is again re-uploaded in 1A or amendment table of 1 or if statement of the subsequent period. Therefore, there will not be any change in the supplier's liability. We will examine another situation where a credit note has been wrongly rejected by the recipient. Actually, whenever a supplier uploads a credit note in his GSTR1, that credit note will get populated in the IMS of the recipient. If the recipient accept that credit note, then this credit note gets populated in GSTR 2B and it will flow into GSTR 3B, and the recipient has to reduce his ITC to that extent of credit note. But what this recipient has done, he has wrongly rejected that credit note. Now what he has to do? He has to inform the supplier. The supplier will again upload that credit note in his GSTR 1A if he has not yet filed his GSTR 3B. If he has already filed his GSTR 3B, then the supplier will have to again upload the credit note in the subsequent month GSTR 1 amendment table or the if amended amendment table, if statement amendment table, right? Then what will happen? Again, this will credit note will come into the IMS of the recipient. Now the recipient has to accept it. It will flow into 2B, it will flow into 3B, and the recipient will be reducing his input tax credit which was availed earlier. Now, what will be the impact on the supplier's liability? Initially, when the original credit note was rejected by the recipient, the liability of the supplier get increased, which will be reflected in his GSTR 3B. That is supplier 3B, the liability gets increased. Now, when the supplier has been informed by the recipient about this wrong rejection, what the supplier has to do? He has to again furnish that credit note in 1A or amendment table of the next month. Then what will happen? Again, the liability of the supplier gets reduced when the amendment is made. So the net effect will be zero, right? The supplier will not also be charged twice. On original rejection, the liability got increased. On amendment, the liability again got decreased. However, one should keep in mind that these amendments have to be carried out within the time limit specified by this statute. That one has to keep in mind. Thanks for watching. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.